Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're taking a look at the brand new GeForce RTX 2060. You know, the 12GB model that gamers were hoping would help solve the GPU shortage. Yeah, well, I suspect most of you probably didn't have high hopes on that one, and those of you that did have probably already lost hope. And that's because despite officially having been announced like 3 weeks ago now on December 7th, there's still basically no stock to be had, and the examples that you can find at retail are grossly overpriced, even when compared to the 6GB model. At the time of making this video, it is possible to purchase a 6GB RTX 2060 from major online parts retailers such as Newegg for $620 US, which is an almost 80% premium over the $350 they sold for back in early 2019. Now, the 12GB model, of which there is just a single example over at Newegg, costs $830 US, so a 34% premium over existing 6GB models, and it is a similar story over here in Australia. So, despite being announced 3 weeks ago, it's nearly impossible to find a 12GB RTX 2060 and certainly impossible to find one at a reasonable price. Of course, Nvidia didn't announce an MSRP for the new 12GB variant, and we suspect they did this to maximize their profit margins. You see, we've always thought it would make sense for AMD and Nvidia to spin up past product lines on older nodes to help alleviate the supply issues, just as Nvidia is finally doing with the 12GB RTX 2060. However, we made the mistake of thinking these companies actually care about gamers. You know, the customers that got them to where they are today, particularly in the case of Nvidia. But they are, of course, companies with no other objective than to maximize profits and please their shareholders. So flooding the market with affordable previous generation products isn't exactly in their best interests, especially when they can just sell those products at unheard of margins to the very people who created this mess for gamers, miners. That being the case, the 12GB RTX 2060 was never intended to be sold to gamers. Instead, Nvidia is looking to further capitalize on the current situation and increase supply to miners. And the longer this goes on, the less they're going to care about gamers. And as upset as gamers are about the current situation, what choice do they have? Moreover, the second mining crashes and things start to go back to normal, gamers will be stampeding over one another to get a shiny new GeForce graphics card. Nvidia knows this, and their only real concern is managing their business after the inevitable end of the cryptocurrency boom. The best way to do this is to sell as many non-competitive gaming graphics cards as they possibly can to miners, so when they do eventually flood the used market, they'll be almost worthless. So by this point, you should understand why the 12GB RTX 2060 exists, and why it's unlikely you'd ever buy one for gaming. Having said all of that though, if by some miracle it ends up making sense for you, how exactly does it perform? Well, to find out, I purchased a Zotac model. It's the one that Tim discussed in this month's GPU pricing update. Basically, it's the only model available here in Australia, and I paid a painful $1,050 Australian for it, though there is now stock listed for $900, which is obviously still a horrible price to pay for an RTX 2060. Now, before we jump into the benchmarks, let's quickly go over the 12GB RTX 2060 specs, as well as the test system. So unlike the original 6GB model, the new 12GB version features 2,176 CUDA cores, so that's the same amount as the 2060 Super, which would make it a 2060 Super, but with more VRAM, making the naming a bit strange. But there is more to it. Unlike the 2060 Super, which uses a 256-bit wide memory bus, the 12GB 2060 uses the same 192-bit wide bus of the original 2060, and that reduces the memory bandwidth from 448GB per second to just 336GB per second, a massive 25% reduction. This means that the 12GB version should perform between the original 6GB 2060 and the newer 2060 Super, and depending on the game and the quality settings used, it may be closer to one or the other. As for the testing, I'm using the Ryzen 9 5950X GPU test system featuring 32GB of dual-rank, dual-channel DDR4 3200CL14 memory. Okay, let's get into the data. We'll start with Assassin's Creed Valhalla at 1080p, and please note these results have been updated with the latest version of the game, which greatly enhanced the performance of high-end GeForce GPUs, with more mild gains for the mid-range or lower-end models, like the RTX 2060. Here, the 12GB model is no faster than the 6GB version, which is obviously disappointing. It meant that both were slightly slower than the 5600 XT. And the situation at 1440p really is no different, with both 2060 models averaging just 49 FPS, again making them slower than even the Radeon RX 5600 XT. Next, we have Cyberpunk 2077, and again, we're looking at very similar performance to that of the 6GB model. Actually, at this point, you can call what we're seeing here at 1080p identical performance, with just 64 FPS on average using slightly dialed down quality settings. That being the case, the numbers at 1440p won't exactly impress, and despite the larger VRAM buffer, performance goes largely unchanged when compared to the older 6GB model. We're looking at 2060 super light performance in Death Stranding at 1080p with 119 FPS on average, making the 12GB 2060 just 5% faster than the 6GB version. Oddly though, as we increase the resolution, the 12GB 2060 drops closer to the 6GB version, as it would appear memory bandwidth is more of an issue here opposed to memory capacity. Moving on, we have some testing with Horizon Zero Dawn, and here we see that the new 12GB 2060 is again found positioned between the 6GB version and the 2060 Super with 83 FPS on average. Then at 1440p, the margin is once again decreased as the larger memory capacity isn't required, and instead memory bandwidth becomes more important. We're looking at up to a 5% boost in Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p, which is about as good as it gets for the 12GB 2060 over the 6GB model. And again, we see that increasing the resolution to 1440p reduces the margin between the 6GB and 12GB models, probably due to having the same 336GB per second memory bandwidth. Finally, we'll take a brief look at the Watch Dogs Legion results, and here the RTX 2060 is rather unimpressive. And regardless of which version we look at, the performance is the same, falling well short of 60 FPS as they trail even the RX 5600 XT. The 5600 XT was also faster at 1440p, and although the 12GB 2060 was up to 9% faster than the 6GB variant, both fell short of a 40 FPS average. I'm going to end the individual game benchmarks there. We do have other games that have tested, and they'll be included in the averages that we'll look at shortly. If you want to see all the graphs, they are available to Floatplane and Patreon members. Okay, so in terms of power consumption, the 12GB model is really no different to that of the 6GB version. In fact, both pushed total system usage when gaming to the same 358 watts, about the same power usage as the faster RTX 3060. So I think it's fair to say that the 12GB version of the GeForce RTX 2060, it performed as expected, maybe even a little worse than expected. It's quite clear that the limited memory bus is choking the GPU a little bit, especially at 1440p. But before we wrap this up, let's take a look at the average performance seen at 1080p and 1440p across all 12 games. And then we'll jump into some look at thermal data, clocks, and all that sort of stuff of this Zotac Gaming twin fan model. Starting with the 1080p results, we see that on average across the 12 games tested, the 2060 12GB was just 4% faster than the original 6GB model. So certainly nothing to write home about. This also made it the second slowest GPU on our test, or technically it was tied with the 5600 XT as the second slowest GPU, and that is really another slow GPU by today's standards, but certainly good enough for 1080p gaming. 1440p was a bit more of a struggle, but even here we saw over 60 FPS on average across the games tested, so that is decent. Again, the 12GB 2060 was 4% faster than the 6GB model, and again roughly on par with the 5600 XT. Now, after 30 minutes of gameplay in a 21-degree room inside an enclosed case, the Corsair Obsidian 500D, the Zotac Gaming RTX 2060 twin fan 12GB peaked at 68 degrees, which is a pretty great result, though the fan speed was a little on the high side at 2200 RPM. Still, the card was relatively quiet at 43 decibels, and not much louder than our test system case fans. This is a stock model, so it operated the AMD reference specification, and this saw a core clock of 1875 MHz on average, with the memory at 14 gigabits per second. So there you have it, the super unexciting 12GB version of the GeForce RTX 2060. Of course, had this model managed to come in at a much lower price point with relatively strong supply, then I think we'd be super excited about its release. But of course, that was never going to be the case. Absolutely was never going to happen. This product was always intended for miners. Frankly, it's my opinion that gamers don't actually require a 12GB version of the RTX 2060. Just give us the old model at a half decent price and it'd be happy days. As sad as that may be, we are just desperate at this point, and Nvidia obviously knows that. And of course, the current situation is great news for them, along with AMD. Therefore, as it stands, the 12GB 2060 is irrelevant for gamers and in no way helps with the current situation. For us though, it was at least interesting to compare a similarly spec'd 2060 with 6 and 12GB of VRAM, and it's an interesting discussion that really heated up back in early 2019. Back then, a lot of viewers criticised the RTX 2060 and our review of it for its lack of VRAM, and we were quite positive about the card despite it only featuring 6GB of VRAM. I felt overall it was a solid product and certainly one of the better offerings in the Turing series. Still, the pushback was quite strong, so I investigated memory usage in 37 games and found that the 2060 worked fine relative to the RTX 2070 at not just 1440p but also 4K, and this led me to conclude that memory usage for the 2060 wouldn't be an issue for years to come, with perhaps the exception of a few outliers that could easily be worked around. It's now been almost 3 years since I published that content, and it's fair to say that the 6GB 2060 is still fine for 1440p gaming, especially given the new 12GB version offered next to nothing in the way of additional performance. That being the case, a production reboot for the 6GB model would be welcomed by gamers, assuming that the pricing made sense, but there's basically no incentive for Nvidia to do this, and given the current market, they'd just be feeding scalpers a new product line anyway, which is another big problem faced by the current supply shortage. And there's not much more to say on this one. We were told by industry contacts prior to the official announcement on the 7th that the 12GB 2060s would be difficult to come across at retail, as this really is a mining-focused product, and if you did manage to find it on shelves, pricing was expected to be terrible, and well, so far it is living up to those promises. If you appreciated this depressing video, then I guess hit the like button. At least that way more gamers can learn that they should avoid the 12GB 2060, at least at the current prices. And of course, don't forget to subscribe because we will have more GeForce and Radeon, new GeForce and Radeon product reviews coming up on the channel early next year. So make sure you subscribe for that. You probably won't be able to buy them, but fingers crossed that things do improve, and at least you'll know how they perform if you subscribe and watch that content. Otherwise, we have Floatplane and Patreon if you want to get more Hardware Unboxed goodness. We have an exclusive Discord server for Hardware Unboxed community members. We do a live stream for you guys, chat with you live, answer your questions, all that sort of stuff. It's a lot of fun. We do that at least once a month. Behind the scenes content, Q&As, so a lot of cool stuff there. So if you're interested, check it out, but if not, that is perfectly fine, and I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.